The recreation chamber aboard the warship Stellar Claw hummed with the sound of young alien soldiers sharing stories during their rest cycle. Their iridescent scales glinted under the soft blue lighting as they lounged on comfort pads, enjoying their brief respite from duties. "And then," said First Scout Smith, his antenna twitching with amusement, "I heard these humans actually believe they can fight with missing limbs. Can you imagine something so absurd?" Laughter rippled through the group. Their bodies, perfectly evolved for combat with reinforced exoskeletons and redundant organ systems, made such claims seem ridiculous. Officer Ree clicked his mandibles in derision. "That's nothing. Yesterday I was reading their historical archives. They have tales of warriors fighting for days without rest, as if any biological entity could maintain combat effectiveness without proper regeneration cycles." In the corner of the chamber, Commander Gray sat quietly, his weathered exoskeleton bearing the marks of countless battles. Deep grooves and poorly healed fractures told stories of their own, but he remained silent as the young soldiers continued their mockery. "My favorite," chirped Medical Officer Stone, "is their claim about something called adrenaline letting them lift vehicles to save their young. Pure fantasy. The mechanical force required would shatter their primitive, calcium-based, skeletal structure." The younger aliens shared another round of clicking laughter, their bodies vibrating with mirth. They were the pride of the Galactic Defense Force, each genetically enhanced and cybernetically optimized for warfare. The idea that soft-bodied humans could match their capabilities seemed like a joke. "Did you know?" added Engineer Rock, waving his upper limbs excitedly. "They don't even have backup organs? Just one heart, 2 lungs, and if they lose them, that's it. How did they even make it to space?" Commander Gray shifted slightly, his scarred hand unconsciously moving to touch the synthetic replacement for his lower right limb. The movement caught Medical Officer Stone's attention. "Commander?" Stone asked, his voice carrying a note of respect. "You've been awfully quiet. Surely you find these human myths as amusing as we do." The chamber grew still. Gray was a legend among their forces, having served in over 50 campaigns. His presence alone commanded attention, and now all eyes turned to him. Gray's outer membranes flickered, a sign of deep thought among their species. "Myths," he said finally, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of age, "often contain kernels of truth." The young soldiers exchanged glances. Engineer Rock's antennae drooped slightly, a sign of confusion. "But Commander, surely you don't believe—" "What I believe," Gray interrupted, "is based on experience, not archives or second-hand tales." He straightened up, his full height impressive even among their tall species. "You mock what you don't understand, and that is dangerous for warriors." First Scout Smith leaned forward, his curiosity overtaking his earlier amusement. "Commander, have you actually fought humans?" The scarred veteran's outer membranes flickered again, and this time, the younger aliens noticed something they hadn't before. A slight tremor in his movements when the subject of humans came up. "Was that fear? Fought them?" Gray's voice grew quieter, forcing them to lean in. "Yes, I've fought humans. And I'll tell you something, young ones. There's a reason we have peace treaties with them now. There's a reason why our high command strictly enforces those treaties." The recreation chamber grew so quiet that the hum of the ship's engine seemed loud in comparison. The earlier mockery felt suddenly childish as they watched their decorated commander's reaction. "Would you tell us about it, sir?" Medical Officer Stone asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Commander Gray looked at each of them in turn, his compound eyes reflecting the blue light. The young soldiers felt the weight of his gaze, heavy with experiences they couldn't imagine. "Perhaps it's time you learn the truth about humans," he said finally. "But I warn you, after this you won't find their capabilities funny anymore." The young aliens gathered closer, their earlier laughter forgotten as Commander Gray prepared to share his story. None of them realized that their understanding of warfare and their place in the galaxy was about to change forever. Commander Gray's outer membranes flickered as he began his tale, his voice carrying the weight of memories he'd rather forget. It was 30 cycles ago during the expansion wars. My unit was considered elite, the best of the best. We'd never failed a mission, never lost a fight. Our bodies were perfectly engineered for combat, and we knew it. Pride was our first mistake. To investigate a small human research outpost on the outer rim. Intelligence suggested it was lightly defended, just a handful of scientists with basic security. Our mission was simple: capture their technology and any survivors for study. We thought it would be easy. Gray's lower limbs shifted uncomfortably. There were 12 of us dropping from orbit in stealth pods. The human facility sat in a clearing, surrounded by dense vegetation. They had basic perimeter sensors, but nothing that could detect our advanced cloaking technology. We watched them for 3 days. He paused, his compound eyes dimming slightly. They seemed so fragile, soft-skinned creatures going about their work. No natural armor, no backup organs, no enhanced strength modifications. We saw them eating, sleeping, working. Such an inefficient species, we thought. How wrong we were. The recreation chamber remained silent as Gray continued. On the 4th day, we launched our attack at dawn. Everything went perfectly at first. We breached their perimeter without triggering any alarms. Our first target was their communications. Array, one precise shot, and they were cut off from help. But then, Gray's voice grew tenser. We encountered our first human defender. A single guard caught in the open by 3 of our warriors. They shot him, clean hits, right through his torso. By all logic, he should have fallen immediately. The young soldiers leaned forward, their earlier mockery forgotten. Instead, Gray continued. This human, with holes in his body that would have killed any of us instantly, raised his weapon and shot back. He killed 2 of our warriors before the 3rd could finish him. We lost 2 elite soldiers to what should have been a dead man. Medical Officer Stone's antenna twitched in disbelief. But that's impossible. With wounds like that, the blood, loss alone. Impossible, Gray interrupted. We thought so too, but it was just the beginning. The gunfire had alerted the facility. We expected panic, chaos. Instead, we got organization, precision. These scientists, these supposedly soft researchers, moved like trained warriors. They had hidden weapon caches throughout the facility. Combat armor appeared from behind false panels. These weren't just scientists, they were military personnel disguised as researchers. Gray's scarred hand traced the synthetic replacement for his lower right limb. But that wasn't what shocked us most. We shot them again and again, and they kept fighting. One human took a plasma bolt to the arm. The limb was practically vaporized. She cauterized it herself with a hot piece of metal and kept firing with her remaining arm. The young aliens shifted uncomfortably as their commander continued. Another human had his legs shattered by our heavy weapons. He dragged himself to a defensive position and held it for 20 minutes, taking down 3 more of our warriors before bleeding out. We'd never seen anything like it. By the time we secured half the facility, we'd lost 7 of our 12-member team. 7 elite warriors against what we thought were simple scientists. Gray's voice trailed off. Then what, Commander? First Scout Smith whispered. Then, Gray said slowly, we met their security chief, a human male, who would teach me the true meaning of terror. He fell silent, his gaze distant. The young soldiers looked at each other, their earlier confidence shaken. The human myths they had laughed at before didn't seem so funny anymore. Would you like to hear what happened next? Gray asked quietly. About how one human warrior changed everything I thought I knew about combat? The recreation chamber filled with eager nods, even as a subtle tremor ran through their bodies. They were about to learn why their commander, one of the most decorated veterans in their forces, still carried the scars, both physical and mental, of his encounter with humanity. Gray's voice grew softer as he continued his story, forcing the young soldiers to lean in closer. After the initial chaos at the facility, their security chief escaped into the surrounding forest. We could have retreated. We'd already lost more than half our unit. But pride and anger clouded our judgment. We decided to hunt. We thought we were hunting him down. Commander Gray's outer membranes rippled with remembered tension. There were 5 of us left, Still confident in our superior tracking abilities, we followed his blood trail through the dense vegetation. The human was badly wounded. We hit him at least 3 times during the facility breach. The forest was dark, with 3 moons casting shifting shadows through the canopy. Our enhanced vision gave us perfect clarity, and we could smell his blood in the air. It should have been an easy track and eliminate mission. The commander's scarred hands clenched. The first trap took out Walker, a simple cord across the path. Primitive. Technology. But when Walker tripped it, sharpened stakes swung down from the trees straight through his armor's weak points. The human had set it up while bleeding out, calculating exactly where we'd step. Medical Officer Stone's antenna twitched nervously. But how could he think so clearly with such severe injuries? That's what we couldn't understand, Gray continued. The blood trail showed he was losing fluids rapidly. By our medical knowledge, he should have been unconscious, and if not dead, instead he was thinking, planning, using the forest against us. We moved more cautiously after that, but it didn't help. The human had scattered false blood trails. We split up to cover more ground. Another mistake. Officer Jones found a trail and radioed in that he was closing in. Those were his last words. The young soldiers sat enraptured, hanging on to every word as Gray described the scene. We found Jones's body 10 minutes later. The human had waited in a tree, dropping down on him from above. Hand-to-hand combat. Something we thought humans would be too weak for. Jones's neck was broken, his armor pierced at the joints with a crude knife made from a broken piece of metal. Gray's voice grew quieter. 3 of us left now. The forest seemed alive with danger. Every shadow could hide death. The human was no longer prey. He had turned the hunt around. We were being stalked. Gray's compound eyes dimmed with the memory. Captain Miller died next. Another trap. This time, a pit covered with vegetation. But not just a pit. The bottom was filled with sharp stakes, and Miller's impalement triggered an explosion. The human had somehow rigged one of our own plasma grenades taken from Jones. Gray's mandibles clicked in frustration. Just me and Lieutenant Green now. We could hear sounds in the forest. Deliberately made sounds. The human was toying with us, drawing us deeper into his killing ground. Green snapped. He started firing, randomly into the trees, screaming about demons and monsters. The commander's voice grew even quieter. The shot that killed Green came from behind us. Somehow the human had circled around. 1 bullet. Perfect placement. Right at the base of Green's skull, where our armor is thinnest. I spun around. But the human was already gone, melting back into the shadows. Gray inhaled deeply, his outer membranes flickering with residual tension. I was alone now. The elite unit that had started this hunt was reduced to a single survivor. He paused. And then I heard it. A sound that still haunts my sleep cycles. Human laughter, echoing through the trees. The young soldiers unconsciously huddled closer together as Gray described the final moments of the hunt. The human's voice called out to me. His words were calm, controlled, showing no sign of the pain he must have been feeling. He said, "You wanted to learn about humans? Lesson's not over yet." Gray paused. His scarred hand again touched his synthetic limb. "Would you like to hear what happened when I finally faced him? How I survived, when the others didn't?" The recreation chamber was silent except for the soft hum of the ship's engines. The young aliens nodded, their earlier bravado completely forgotten, replaced by a growing understanding of why their commander treated human capabilities with such respect. "Very well," Gray said. "But remember, what comes next is why we have peace treaties now, why we never, ever want humans as enemies again." Commander Gray's antenna trembled slightly as he prepared to continue his story. The young soldiers noticed his outer membranes had taken on a paler shade, a sign of deep emotional stress in their species. "I did something then that none of our kind had ever done in combat," Gray said. "I tried to talk to him to understand. The room was deathly silent. I asked him how he could still fight with such severe wounds." Gray's gaze darkened. His answer changed everything I thought I knew about humans. The commander's voice took on a clinical tone. He explained that humans evolved from pursuit predators. Their ancestors would chase prey until it collapsed, from exhaustion. This gave them something unique, an ability to ignore their body's need to stop. Gray's mandibles clicked. But that wasn't all. The human told me about something called the fight-or-flight response. When humans face danger, their bodies undergo a complete transformation. Their blood vessels constrict to reduce bleeding. Their pain receptors shut down. Their muscles receive more oxygen. They become something else entirely. Medical Officer Stone's professional curiosity was clear. But, Commander, that kind of biological response should be impossible to maintain. The energy cost alone? Impossible? Gray let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Look at me, young one. Look at my scars. Look at my synthetic limb. His compound eyes locked onto them, unblinking. I learned that day that impossible means something very different to humans. The room was frozen in anticipation. The human explained that their bodies produce chemicals, adrenaline, endorphins, cortisol, that can push them far beyond their normal limitations. Gray's voice darkened. And the more desperate the situation, the stronger these chemicals become. First, Scout Smith's antenna drooped slightly in confusion. But wouldn't that burn out their systems, cause complete organ failure? Yes. Gray nodded. And they do it anyway. The young soldier shuddered. That's what makes them so terrifying. A human backed into a corner doesn't become weaker. They become stronger, more dangerous. Their bodies literally trade their future survival for present combat effectiveness. The commander's voice grew heavy with remembered awe and fear. He told me how human mothers have lifted vehicles, weighing tons to save their young, how human soldiers have continued fighting with mortal wounds, their bodies held together by nothing but sheer willpower. And these chemicals. Gray exhaled sharply. But the most frightening part? His outer membranes flickered rapidly. They can't fully control this response. It's automatic, instinctive. A human doesn't choose to ignore pain or fight beyond their limits. Their body simply does it. Gray's compound eyes reflected the blue lighting of the chamber as he studied his audience. It's encoded into their very DNA, a legacy of their evolution as persistence hunters. The young soldiers sat in stunned silence. Gray's voice turned grim. That's why our initial attack went so wrong. He leaned forward. We thought we were facing soft scientists instead. Instead, we faced creatures whose bodies automatically transform into combat machines when threatened. Every injury, every setback, it just triggered more of these chemical changes, making them more dangerous. Gray exhaled sharply. The human laughed when he told me this. He said, "Your kind evolved to be perfect soldiers. We evolved to never stop fighting, no matter what." Then he asked me, "Which do you think is more dangerous?" Engineer. Rock's voice was barely a whisper. Is that why High Command enforces the PE treaties so strictly? Yes. Gray nodded solemnly. Because we discovered that humans don't just fight until they win. They fight until they physically cannot fight anymore. And that point is far, far beyond what any rational species would consider possible. The commander's compound eyes swept across his audience. Would you like to hear what happened next? How? This conversation ended in a confrontation, one that cost me my limb. And nearly my life? The young soldiers nodded. Their earlier mockery of human capabilities was gone. They understood now. Their commander had remained silent during their jokes, not because he was amused, but because he had been remembering terrors they couldn't imagine. Very well, Gray said, his voice growing tight with tension. But remember, what I'm about to tell you is why every combat manual now lists humans as extreme threat entities, to be engaged only as an absolute last resort. The confrontation Commander Gray's voice grew hoarse as he continued his tale. The recreation chamber's blue lighting seemed to dim, matching the gravity of his words. After our conversation in the forest, I thought I understood humans better. I was wrong. Understanding their biology didn't prepare me for what came next. The commander's scarred hands trembled slightly. The human emerged from the shadows. Even now I remember every detail. His uniform was soaked with blood. 3 plasma burns marked his body. His left arm hung useless at his side. By any rational standard, he should have been dead. Gray's outer membrane shuddered, but his eyes, they weren't the eyes of a dying creature. They burned with something I'd never seen before. Not rage, not fear, but pure, unrelenting determination. The young soldiers leaned forward. He moved like his wounds didn't exist. Our medical scans later showed he had a punctured lung, severe internal bleeding, and multiple fractures. Yet he moved with deadly precision. Gray's mandibles clicked softly. I raised my weapon, but he was faster. The first shot took my lower right limb, a clean hit right at the joint. I fell, but my combat training kicked in. I rolled, returned fire, hit him twice more, center mass, the kind of hits that would drop any of us instantly. Gray's voice carried a lingering note of disbelief. He didn't even flinch. The room was silent except for the hum of the ship's engines. He just kept coming. Gray's hand trembled slightly as he touched his synthetic limb. I managed to get behind a fallen tree, called for emergency extraction, but he was always one step ahead. The human had circled around while I was distracted. He dropped, from above, just like with Jones. But I was ready. Gray inhaled sharply. We fought hand to hand, my 3 remaining limbs, against his one good arm, and sheer will. The commander's voice dropped to a whisper. That's when I learned another terrifying truth about humans. The young soldier's antennae twitched anxiously. Their bones. Gray's voice was hollow. They don't break clean like ours, they splinter. A ripple of unease spread through his audience. When the human struck me, his broken arm should have been useless. Instead, Gray's mandibles clicked shut. The jagged bone edges became weapons. The young aliens unconsciously touched their own smooth exoskeletons. Their species' bones were rigid, clean fractures, logical, predictable. But humans? Their very biology turned their own broken bodies into weapons. Gray's voice was lower now. He was dying. Every movement cost him blood he couldn't spare, but his eyes, they never changed. That same burning determination. No fear, no hesitation. Just the absolute certainty that he would not stop fighting. Not until one of us was dead. The cost of underestimation. That human would complete his mission, or die trying. Gray's voice had dropped to a whisper. I managed to land what should have been a killing blow, pierced straight through his remaining good shoulder with my blade arm. He scanned the young soldiers, their antennae twitching. In anticipation, do you know what he did? They shook their heads, entranced by the tale. Gray exhaled. He grabbed my blade arm with his impaled shoulder, locked me in place. Then he used his broken arm to strike again. And again. Those splintered bones, they tore through my armor. Ripple of unease spread through his audience. The pain was unbearable, but I couldn't break free. Gray's mandibles clicked softly. His grip was like industrial steel. Silence. Then Gray continued, his voice quieter now. That's when my emergency extraction team arrived. The human heard the ships coming. And do you know what he said to me? Gray's outer membrane spasmed, his tone dropping to a whisper. He said, remember this. Remember what happens when you corner humans. The young soldiers shivered. The extraction team had to pry his dead fingers off my arm. Even in death, his grip didn't loosen. Gray's voice grew distant. The medic said his muscles had locked up. His last action preserved by his body's final surge of chemicals. The commander looked at each soldier in turn. The human died there in that forest, but he achieved his mission. The facility's core data, wiped. Half of our elite unit, dead. The rest of us, wounded or traumatized. All because we underestimated what humans are capable of. Gray inhaled deeply. Would you like to hear what we learned later? Why humans are the way they are? About the evolutionary pressures that created such terrifying capabilities? The young soldiers nodded. Their earlier bravado? Gone. They weren't just hearing a war story anymore. They were learning why their entire military doctrine had changed after first contact with humans. The science of a nightmare. Very well, Gray said, his voice low. But remember, what I'm about to tell you is why we now train our soldiers to avoid pushing humans to their breaking point. His compound eyes gleamed under the dim lights. Because when humans break, they don't collapse. They transform into something nightmarish. A holographic display flickered to life, showing the human evolutionary path. Gray gestured at the swirling data. Most species evolve to either fight or flee from danger, but humans? His mandibles clicked. They evolved to do both. And more importantly, to keep doing it, long past the point where other species would have given up. The soldiers leaned forward, eyes wide with unease. Their ancestors weren't the strongest or the fastest, but they survived through sheer persistence. They would chase prey under the hot sun for days, following tracks, never stopping, until their target collapsed from exhaustion. Gray turned to the soldiers, his gaze sharp. This gave them something unique in the galaxy. The ability to override their body's survival instincts. A young officer shifted uncomfortably. But, Commander, how does that make them such dangerous warriors? Gray sighed. Because these same traits that let them chase prey for days also let them fight beyond normal biological limits. The holographic display shifted, revealing a human's internal anatomy. Look at their redundant systems. If their liver is damaged, other organs take over some functions. If they lose blood, their bodies automatically redirect it to vital organs. Their bones? Gray's mandibles twitched. They can repair themselves, and sometimes they come back even stronger at the breakpoints. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. But the most frightening part, Gray continued, is their brain chemistry. They developed something called the runner's high. A murmur rippled through the room. Gray nodded. A reward system that releases pleasure chemicals during prolonged physical stress. This same system activates during combat. One of the younger officers, First Scout Smith, stammered, "They enjoy fighting?" "Not exactly," Gray corrected. "But their bodies reward them for pushing through pain and exhaustion. The harder they push, the more those chemicals flow. It's a feedback loop, one that keeps them going far beyond what should be possible." A thick silence hung in the room. Our scientists discovered something else. Gray's voice was grim. When placed under severe stress, human combat capabilities actually increase. The holographic display shifted to a battlefield simulation. Gray pointed. Their visual processing speeds up. Their strength multiplies. Their pain tolerance becomes almost unlimited. A murmur of unease spread through the soldiers. They enter what they call hyperfocus, or combat flow. Most species, Gray explained, become less effective as they tire or take damage. Humans, they become more dangerous. Every injury, every setback, triggers more of these survival chemicals. They literally evolve into better warriors in the middle of a fight. A stunned silence filled the room. Gray's voice dropped to a whisper. There's a human phrase, fight like a cornered animal, but even that doesn't capture it. A cornered animal will eventually submit when it knows it's beaten. Humans? Gray shook his head. They've evolved past that instinct. They will fight until their bodies physically shut down. The change in military doctrine. The holographic display vanished. Gray turned to the soldiers, his voice low and steady. This is why our combat doctrine changed. He met their eyes one by one. We discovered that traditional military tactics don't work against humans. The more you hurt them, the harder they fight. The more you corner them, the more dangerous they become. Engineer Rock's voice quavered. Is that why we have the non-engagement protocols? Exactly. Gray nodded solemnly. Our high command realized that any conflict with humans would become a war of attrition. And while we might win individual battles, humans would never stop. They would keep fighting, keep adapting, keep coming back until either they won or were completely exterminated. Gray's membranes flickered. The human who nearly killed me. Our medical analysis showed that he had enough combat chemicals in his system to kill most species by themselves. His body was literally burning itself up, just to keep fighting. The soldiers sat frozen, their mockery of humans long forgotten. Gray straightened. Would you like to hear why we now maintain peace with humans at almost any cost? The chamber was silent. Then slowly, the soldiers nodded. The true meaning of persistence. Perfect warriors, multiple hearts, redundant organs, enhanced strength, regenerative capabilities. Gray's outer membranes flickered rapidly. But humans, he let the silence stretch. Humans showed us that being a perfect warrior isn't about having the best biological systems. It's about never stopping, no matter what. The young soldiers listened, their earlier bravado long gone. Gray's voice grew heavy. Our high command ran simulations of full-scale war with humans. The results were disturbing. He let that word sink in before continuing. We would win the first battles, maybe even the first few campaigns. But humans, Gray's compound eyes darkened. They would study every defeat, adapt, improve, and they would never, ever stop. A hushed ripple of unease passed through the room. First Scout Smith's antennae drooped, but surely our superior technology, Gray cut him off, would mean nothing in the long run, because humans have another trait we didn't understand at first. They learn from failure. Gray's tone sharpened. Every defeat makes them stronger, more determined. Where other species see failure as a reason to retreat, humans see it as a lesson. He activated another holographic display, showing battle statistics from human history. Our analysts found something else, something we struggled to comprehend. They call it spite. A few of the younger soldiers exchanged glances, confused. Gray's membranes twitched. It's an emotional response that makes them fight harder when they're losing. They will sacrifice everything, their resources, their bodies, their lives, just to prove their opponent wrong. The hologram flickered, cycling through countless wars, rebellions, and uprisings throughout human history. Gray gestured toward the display. Look at their history. Every time a technologically superior force thought they had defeated humans, the humans came back stronger. They don't accept defeat. They just change tactics and keep fighting. Why the peace treaties exist. This is why our peace treaties are so strictly enforced, Gray explained. Because we realized something terrifying. Any conflict with humans would only end in one of two ways. Either they would win, or both sides would be destroyed. There is no middle ground with them. A heavy silence filled the room. Medical Officer Stone hesitated, then finally spoke. But Commander, surely their biological limitations are their greatest strength, Gray cut in. Because they evolved knowing they had those limitations. It made them innovative, ruthless when necessary, and most importantly, it made them value cooperation over individual prowess. Gray's voice took on a tone of grim admiration. Humans don't fight as individuals. They fight as groups. They compensate for each other's weaknesses. When one falls, another steps up. They call it leaving no one behind. And it makes them exponentially more dangerous than their individual capabilities would suggest. The hologram faded. The final analysis was clear. Gray continued. Any species that pushes humans too far will face an enemy that doesn't. He looked each soldier in the eyes as he spoke. Recognize surrender. Accept defeat. Stop fighting. They will sacrifice everything to win. And the more you hurt them, the stronger they become. The young soldiers sat frozen, absorbing every word. The final warning. So remember this. Gray's voice was quiet but firm. When you're out there on patrol, when you're dealing with human ships or colonies, remember what I told you. Treat them with respect. Follow the protocols. Because if we ever break the peace treaties, if we ever push them into another war. Gray's compound eyes dimmed, his membranes rippling with something that almost resembled fear. We won't be fighting the soft bodies you mocked earlier. He let the weight of that settle, We'll be fighting an enemy that evolution itself has designed to never give up, never stop, and never accept defeat. He looked at each young soldier in turn. Do you understand now? Do you see why your jokes about human capabilities weren't funny to those of us who have faced them in combat? The young aliens nodded solemnly, their arrogance completely extinguished. They understood now. They had mocked something they did not comprehend, and that kind of ignorance could have been fatal in the wrong circumstances. Gray exhaled, satisfied. Good. Because the most important lesson I learned that day in the forest, it wasn't about human biology. It wasn't about their combat capabilities. It was this. He let the words hang in the air, cold and final. In all the galaxy, there is nothing more dangerous than a species that refuses to know when it's beaten. The recreation chamber fell silent, and the young soldiers finally understood the true meaning of persistence.